Welcome to the University of Birmingham Research Seminar Series, and thank you for joining us for this presentation titled Afrosonic Mime, a Post-psychophysical Perspective by Dr. Samuel Ravengai. I should start also by doing some housekeeping, particular to South Africa. South Africans often deal with power cuts and something called load shedding, which is when the internet goes down in certain areas. And there's a small chance of us negotiating that in this session, and we'll work with one another through that process if it happens. So today's presentation was, what was that? Do we have a comment? No. Today's presentation is part of a new global exchange between the University of the Witwatersrand in South Africa and the University of Birmingham in the UK that excavates decoloniality and performance in higher education. And this emerging conversation is rooted in Samuel's mentorship of a previous research project of mine on decolonizing language ideologies in the performer's body. And in this experience, I observed Samuel's deep understanding of African performance modes, his skill as a director and performer trainer in investigating these modes in relationships and languages, and his ability to reflect on such phenomena as situated in relation to nodes of power at various indigenous, national, continental, and global levels. Samuel has been pioneering a new field of research as an author, pedagogue, and director for over 20 years. As an author, his contributions have led in the areas of Zimbabwean colonial and decolonial theatre, furthered the key concepts decolonization and embodiment in an African performance context, and articulated the new concept Afroscenology. In various publications, including Theatre from Rhodesia to Zimbabwe, Germany Identity and a Contested Post-Colony in 2021, he closely outlines the construction of knowledge that justified the domination of Africans in pre-democracy Zimbabwe. He shows how this knowledge was mirrored by those creating and writing on performance at the time, and in so doing, carving out degrading views of African performance modes. His cutting criticality rewrites South African history, as we have often been handed it, and Southern African history, inclusive of Zimbabwe and South Africa and a number of other areas, and makes sense of the tensions between Euro epistemologies and African theatre and performance. His chapter, The Dilemma of the African Body as a Side of Performance in the Context of Western Training in 2011, usefully defines African realism versus Western realism as a starting point for adapting intercultural models for training actors to explore post-linear playtext. His conceptualization of embodiment as differently articulated through culture is part of his proposal for how Afroscenology provides a way forward that is adaptive to African embodiment for actor training. These crucial ideas have been furthered in his recent research and are shared with you today. I'll just let someone in. As a pedagogue, Samuel has been similarly entrepreneurial, having set up and led departments throughout Zimbabwe and South Africa. He was a founding member of the University of Zimbabwe's Department of Theatre Arts, and in his role as associate professor at the Department of Theatre and Performance, University of the Witwatersrand, and former head of department, Samuel has recently rewritten the BA curriculum so that it reframes African performance modes and rearticulates embodiment within its languages, structures, and reading lists. Samuel is a known director with similar accolades, directing more than 20 productions guided by African philosophies which centralize the body as a nucleus for performance. And with that, I introduce Dr. Samuel Ravengai with his presentation of new research on Afrosonic Mine. I'll stop sharing for a moment.
Thank you, Claire, for your kind words. I do appreciate your invitation to participate in this series of lectures and seminars hosted by university, where you invited the University of Witwatersrand. Thank you for introducing me, and I'm going to speak to you all who are listening to me virtually on Afrosonic Mine, a post post-psychophysical perspective. Obviously, the term itself has never been used. It is my own creation, including the theory under which I will discuss the concept of Afrosonic Mine. So I will take time to speak to both terms, Afrosonic Mime and Afroscenology, before I talk about its realization in the context of a performance. So first of all, let me just go through the abstract that was circulated to you so we all have a better understanding of what it is that I'm pursuing this evening. This presentation proposes the performatic technique of Afroscenology as a departure from psychophysical perspectives. I have defined Afroscenology as including three major components: the theory of the performer as the Afro-technique. Of course, I don't have time to discuss that, but I'll just pick one aspect from the Afro-technique, which is the Afrosonic Mime, as part of a better understanding of that technique. And the theory of the playtext, which I'm calling theatric theory, and the theory of the Afrosonic Mime as a performatic technique. Now, as you can see, I'm just talking or giving you these three aspects, but the bottom line is I'm not gonna touch on any of those except the one that I've just called Afrosonic Mine. So while the technique was observed occurring as tacit knowledge in several African productions across Zimbabwe and South Africa, my examples will be drawn from several laboratory performances at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, where I serve as one of the three lecturers. Now, I teach the presentational performance under the rubric African Aesthetic as one of the three performer training lecturers who run the 2-year course called Performance Practice, which used to be called Acting, now in the Department of Theatre and Performance. During the first semester at first year level, students develop a performance from a presentational or post-realist play belonging to what we refer to as the African great tradition. At second year level, students devise their own work deploying this Afro-technique that they would have been exposed to throughout the entire semester. So I analyze these examples to discuss how Afrosonic Mime makes the invisible visible. While discussing this tenet of Afroscenology, I seek to relanguage the practice and develop critical vocabulary to share the technique with scholars across the global South and North. And I think that is the use of theory. It is to give us a language to speak about something that we don't know. And this is what the paper, the chapter, the presentation seeks to do this evening. Now, let me start by contextualizing Afrosonic Mime. Now, Afrosonic Mime is one of the theoretical tenets of a theory that I propounded called Afroscenology. I think this theory is now online for free for those who would like to have a further engagement with it so that you have a better understanding more than what the time that I have can provide today. Now, since both the theory and its tenet are new, I want to explain both their historical origins. Afroscenology is an extension of something that you probably already know by now called Afrocentricity. And Afroscenology is an extension in the field of theater and performance of that theory. Now, the theory was propounded by Molefe Asante, is African-American based in the United States of America. He propounded the theory, which has been applicable largely in comparative literature, probably very much unknown in theater and performance. I would like to quickly go through some of the principles or tenets that anchor this theory so that we have a better understanding of what it is that I'm trying to pursue in the discussion tonight. He suggested a tenet which he called intellectual jerd. Intellectual jerd is, I think, an Egyptian term which means a strong place to stand, and the Greeks call it a stasis. And he proposes Africa as a strong place to stand for both Africans and Africanists who are interested in writing about Africa. Remember, everything is always articulated from a perspective. Examples and methods and theories are always derived from a particular angle, from a particular geopolitical space. And the space that Molefe Asante proposes is that of Africa, so that everything else is seen from the perspective of Africa rather than somewhere else. And I think this is where the debate on Eurocentricity or Eurocentrism or Orientalism or Afrocentrism will came about. Now, the next tenet of the theory is the center. Traditionally, we have had three centers in the world: Lisbon, London, and Paris, and of course, with their colonies being the peripheries. Now, the fact of the matter is that all knowledge, values, and meaning were derived from these three centers, and the rest of the world were supposed to obey whatever meaning was generated from the center. Now, Molefe Asante then proposes that Africa needs a center of its own, given that there is a lot of commonality, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, where most of the people were or once belonged to a single linguistic group called the Bantu. In fact, they speak Bantu languages that are a related conglomerate of languages sharing the same culture, sometimes words and aspects of the language even today. So if that could be mobilized, and I know linguists are already working around the notion of creating a prototype Bantu language based on the words that people use. And of course, most of you may be aware that the African Union will be transforming from being just a union to a country at some point. And they are beginning to do that from the financial sector side, creating a bank, creating blocks, creating a trade area with trillions of dollars that are invested in that particular market. But that's a story for another day. The fact of the matter is he is calling for the creation of a center, but without jettisoning other centers that already exist. It becomes one of the other centers that do exist in the world. And then he spoke about agency, which is the ability to exercise choice, even when one is framed or confined by frameworks that debilitate the expression of that agency. And in this particular case, he wanted African characters, African people to exercise agency wherever they are. There cannot be any lack of agency, as opposed to African characters that appear in Western generated texts, where they may be objects being tossed around by forces of oppression and so on and so on. And then he also proposed a fourth tenet, which he called Njia, way or Afri way, which is very close to the center that I spoke about above. And then he spoke about collective consciousness, and this entails the awareness of collective history and future. There should be a deep commitment to Africa, fraternal reactions to assaults on African humanity. And again, the issue of collective consciousness is derived from what Marxists call the structure of feeling, that human beings or subjects or players, actors that reside in a certain political, geopolitical space will experience similar forces that affect them at the same time, causing a structure of feeling to form within them, so that without the aid of a conference or a meeting of sorts, they tend to create works that reflect the same ideology. And this is how movements like Black consciousness or Black art, in the case of Western Europe, modernism and postmodernism emerged. They were responding to particular historical contexts that created a certain expression in music and art and so on and so on. And then he was asking African people to use that collective consciousness to create work that speak for Africa. And of course, the issue of liberation, which began with liberation struggles throughout the rest of the continent, but liberation struggles only bring political emancipation, and he was calling for psychological, economic, social, and cultural emancipation. You can see I'm more interested in the psychological aspect and culture, which is where theater and performance are located. And the reason why I am creating or propounding this theory of Afroscenology in order to liberate the African space by way of providing a philosophy through which cultural products can be critiqued. And then he looked at, lastly, this is the last theoretical tenet, what he called Diopian thought, which is the reinterpretation of history given the distortions of the past. Of course, history written from a Western perspective about Africans, where they do not always exercise their agency, but are toiled or tossed around like objects in their own space. So these are some of the things that have been used in literature when critiquing African literature, and of course in African studies. So these are the general principles that guide my theory as I extend it into the domain of theater and performance. Now, having said this, I want to say that given the complicated history of the African continent, which has seen part of its identity molded by colonialism, slavery, Christianity, Islam, and other transnational influences. Actually, this is a characteristic of all people, including Western Europe, for that matter. So the construction of this theory is not a regression into an isolated nativistic approach. It is a reflection of everything that makes up contemporary African performance. So the beauty of the theater practice from which this theory is constructed is that it cannot be found anywhere in the world except in Africa and parts of its diaspora. So for that reason, it deserves an identity of its own encapsulated in the term Afroscenology. Just like structuralism provides a norm for understanding and talking about the structure of text and words, units of text and performance, design, or realism provides rules of creating a constructed reality. Afroscenology provides norms, standards, rules, values, or in short, a language to create and critique African playtexts, performances, designs, choreography, writing, voice, directing derived from the African canon itself. So the practice, let me say, already exists as tacit knowledge. This chapter presentation turns tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge by providing the concepts and vocabulary to read the work. Now, having given you that background and context, I now want to focus specifically on the term Afrosonic Mine. I use the term to refer to a type of mime deployed by African performers when they reproduce physical action, which signals an absent referent. Whatever the signified may be, for example, an object, a prop, a boundary, a force, feeling, whatever shape the referent may take. I do understand that all cultures can mime. However, they do not possess the same language to express that which is mime. Thus, Lecockian, Attaudian, and Grotesquian mime differ significantly from Afrosonic mime. While in Western mime, for example, music is normally deployed, especially in pantomime, to accompany what is mimed through the hands and facial grimaces. In Afrosonic mime, musical amplification is not part of the embodiment, but performers mobilize a soundscape produced by their own vocal instruments. Now, this soundscape, except in special circumstances, reproduces the sound of the referent under similar conditions of the action being mimed. Now, if it is a bomb explosion, opening of a door, knocking, cooking, and so on, the performers who enact the action realistically produce the sound of the action by their voices. While music in Western mime or any other culture is experienced visceral rather than intellectual, it causes a semiotic problem in the sense that it is an icon which shares little or no connection with its signified. It is simply an emotional experience. In an African presentational or post-realist play or performance which deploys a soundscape produced by the live human body, with a few possible exceptions, the sound refers to something that is already known in human memory. I therefore use the term Afrosonic Mime to designate it as a separate but related practice. Afrosonic is a compound word formed from Afro, which links the practice to the geopolitical space of Africa. The prefix is combined with sonic to suggest that the practice depends on the deployment of vocal oral elements as means of signification, such as I have described above. Now, in order to make sense of this theoretical tenet of Afroscenology, which is Afrosonic Mine, I want to make sense of it by deploying a concept first conceived by Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, and developed further by Manuel de Landa, called assemblage theory. Assemblage theory there is the key term. So indeed, the decolonization of theory by manufacturing new theory from the global south does not necessarily mean the rejection of Western theory or philosophy. As correctly coined or noted by Nigam, decolonization is simply treating, in brackets, Western theory as one among the many sources of thinking. That is to say, we must think across traditions as opposed to jettisoning Western theory. So Nigam goes on to make a fundamental observation on which my use of assemblage theory is predicated. He assessed that at its most fundamental level then, theoretical decolonization is about standing on our feet, which is Africans, and thinking for ourselves, drawing resources for that thought like intellectual bricoleurs from all manner of sources. That is what theory and philosophy are always meant to help us with. As you can see from this quotation by a decolonial scholar, there is reason to think across boundaries and to mobilize any other concept that may assist in explaining an African concept, in this case, the assemblage theory. Now, let me make sense of this concept of assemblage. Before the concept was translated to English as assemblage, the French coiners of the concept called it agencement, which speaks to the process of fitting and matching together and the outcome of such action. However, when the creators of the concept, Gilles Deleuze and Felix Guattari, started explaining it and linking it to separate aspects of their philosophy, it started developing multiple meanings to a point where the different definitions could no longer be reduced to a single coherent notion. However, for purposes of working ethos, assemblage is defined as a multiplicity which is made of many heterogeneous terms and which establishes liaisons, relations between them across ages, sexes, and reigns, different natures. Thus, the assemblage's only unit is that of co-functioning. It is a symbiosis. A sympathy. It never affiliations which are important, but alliances, alloys. These are not successions, line of descent, but contagions, epidemics, the wind. Of course, I'm quoting there metaphorically. Now, assemblages are not restricted to material objects, but many other elements which may be intangible. So intangible is my key word there. The theater in general is made up of assemblages of the cast, set design, lighting, sound and costume designs. In the case of African presentational or post-realist plays, the performance itself is made up of the spoken word, dialogue and text, dance, mime, song, all supported by a robust design of set, costume, and lighting. Now, theater, by its very nature, is an assemblage of various constituent elements and their linkage in creating meaning. Now, Frank Camilleri has made an interesting observation on what he calls dynamic hybrids, to refer to non-human organisms and objects as part of sociality. When these non-human agents are deployed in theater, they participate in the meaning-making process and take on the roles of actors. Now, relying on earlier work by Greimas, Camilleri calls these human and non-human agents actants, arguing that they are intertwined in conditions of hybridity. Because the term actor and its derivative actant are problematic in describing African post-realist theater, I prefer to use the term performer, keyword, and performance to describe similar relationships. Now, in applying the concept of assemblage to theater, Camilleri extends the possibility of linkages beyond material objects, which he calls materialities, to include the world of thoughts, imaginations, conventions, ideologies, and so on. Now, these immaterial entities affect and equally contribute to the constitution of the material world. In the case of realist, naturalist theater, there's a tendency to ignore the immaterial, the invisible, and focus on the material, visible performance in analysis. While all other performances of the assemblage are important in explaining the concept, what is of interest to me in discussing Afrosonic mime is the assemblage of the human agent, the performer, and what he or she imagines. Now, the other immaterialities at this moment are not important, and I'm going to skip them so that I focus on the human performant and what the human imagines, which is the immaterialities in his or her mind, which will be brought to bear on the stage as they perform in the form of mime. Now, as you can see, I'm beginning to name the world or to name the practice by giving it terms. And the first term that I want to give to some of the ways of realizing Afrosonic mime is imagistic imagination. Now, it is this articulation between the performer and the imagined object which shapes the manner of Afrosonic mime. The greatest tool in realizing the mime is imagination. Now, the imagination produces the image of the non-human performant and places it in the theater space and allows the human agent to navigate around the imagined performant, the non-human performant. And I call this imagistic imagination. Now, in realist, naturalist theater, the material world is represented by material objects which imitate those in reality. The stage then activates everything which is put on it with a signifying power which they lack in reality. Now, in African post-realist theater, non-human performance do not normally have a physical presence. It is the human performance that bring the non-human performance into existence through imagination. In the hands of a gifted performer, the imagined world with all its materialities, such as doors, windows, oceans, rivers, chairs, corridors, will be made visible by way of mime. So the performance seen by the audience will be experienced through representation of those signs in the mind and their manipulation in their absence. I just want to take this box out of my way. Now, what does Afrosonic mime seek to do in the economy of theater as an art form? And I'm subtitling this discussion as overcoming the limitations of the medium of theater. Now, mime is meant to overcome the limitations of the medium of theater in conveying material reality. In the case of Afrosonic mime, it has developed specific conventions which I will be theorizing below. I will be answering the following questions. How does Afrosonic mime overcome the limitations of theater in conveying information of the material reality? How does Afrosonic mime overcome the limitations of the medium of theater in conveying information, activities that are taking place in the mind of the character or in a human organ such as a stomach, vagina, penis, and so on and so on? How does mime overcome the limitations of the medium of theater in presenting machines on stage, like a helicopter, a bomb blast, an aeroplane, or vast expanses of geographical space like an ocean, a river, and so on and so on. How does mime overcome the limitations of the medium of theater in shifting from one location to the other? How does mime overcome the limitations of budget? Allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to take a different leaf, which is a description of a laboratory session that I did with my students. I would have shown you a video, but I didn't have the opportunity to edit it so that we could have a common reference point when I offer the terms that speak to the qualities of this theoretical tenet that I've called Afrosonic Mine. But in the place or in the absence of a video, I'm going to do a short, thick description of a laboratory performance by my second-year students, which was called Kwapalwalo. And it begins as follows. This is a story about a family headed by a single mother with 4 girls and 1 boy. The mother opens the story by calling her children in song, and they immediately enter the stage with much singing and dancing. They are all wearing scarves on their necks and use black pants as costume to indicate that the body is neutral and will be a vehicle to play different personas and inanimate objects. The mother introduces herself and the story, and suddenly the children lower their volume of their singing while continuing the playful dancing to give room for the mother's voice to be heard. As she speaks, she uses realistic miming of laying clothes on the imaginary line, picking them from the laundry dish. When she is done with hanging the clothes on an imaginary line, she mimes holding the dish and walks upstage. The children then take turns to introduce themselves and their hierarchy in the family. There is a moment of transition where all create the kinetic tableau of a van. They produce its erratic starting sound, shaking like its body. They produce its engine as they begin to move around the stage. Simultaneously, they shift between producing the noise of the car and playing humans and passengers. So as they play the car, they simultaneously play passengers by having a human exchange as the car is moving. All this is produced in a single human machine, shaking, moving, talking at the same time, and the scarves are still wound around their necks. Transition number 2. The mother, Majobe, comes back. A scarf has been shoved into her black t-shirt, creating a pregnant mother. So the position of the scarf has now changed. She shifts down in a delivery position. The rest of the performers form a kinetic tableau, which suggests a vagina. The scarves are removed from their necks to adorn the vagina with several layers of cloth, which suggest labia and pubic hair. The opening is occupied by one of the performers. As the mother cries in agony, the movement of the vagina is magnified in the kinetic tableau, which results in the baby being delivered. The vagina plays itself, but at the same time, it plays as a chorus to inspire the delivery of to inspire the mother to deliver the baby. Push, push, push. The baby somersaults its way out, and the mother removes the scarf from her tummy and holds the scarf like a baby in her arms. The rest of the performance transition from a vagina to a gate leading to the house of a sangoma or a shaman. The scarves are used to embellish the entrance. So I want you to notice the journey of the scarf. The scarf are used to embellish the entrance. The bodies of performers create the threshold through which the sangoma/shaman enters, followed by the mother miming carrying the baby, but she's carrying a scarf. The performers sing a song as they form a gate. The singing causes the sangoma to enter a spiritual realm with much shaking and shrieking. The metaphysical realm is embodied by the other performers who dissolve the gate and perform the spirit that has possessed the sangoma. The scarps now transition to become objects of creating the spiritual realm. So they use them to flash, to make them play in the air, using abstract movements of the scarp. So the scarps now transition to become objects of creating the spiritual realm. What we can't see inside the sangoma is given substance through the movement of other performers. The movements are abstract. The sangoma picks up an incident in the past which caused the Majobe, the mother, to move to Johannesburg. This incident is acted out by the rest of the cast in mime while Majobe narrates the story. Performers illustrate the story through vignettes. The shift between illustration, spirits, and sharing the lines of the sangoma shaman in chorus format. As the consultation comes to an end, performers move back to form a gate in a kinetic tableau through which the sangoma and Majobe will exit the sacred space. At this stage, performers have transitioned into several personas and themes. They have not maintained one character as would be the case in a Lecoq mime performance. The gate dissolves with the performance of a transitional connector characterized by all performers rotating on the same axis and producing a rewind sound. The connector ends with the formation of an earlier van producing the same van and children's sounds as they move around the stage, ending back into the family settings. The scarves return back to the neck to establish the initial characters of family members. Majobe, the mother, is the only one who wears a scarf differently. The scarf is transitioned from being a baby to a wrapper worn around the bottom of a body. This is how most African mothers are adorned. They have a wrapper around the neck, around their waist. The scarf wrapper becomes a marker of identity and hierarchy. There's a family meeting where the mother lays out her plans to go and work for the family. A conflict ensues between the mother and children about who will take responsibility for the family. The conflict dissolves or transitions to a song, Hambio Sevenza, which means go and work, where players and performers organize themselves into a line with scarves now in their waist position to suggest seat belts. They are now sitting in a train. They move in motions which mime a train. The train comes to a stop, allowing Majobe to disembark, miming carrying luggage on her back. Slowly, the train dissolves and its various components become human beings working as receptionists, miming talking on the phone. This is the city in which Majobe, the mother, moves through to find work. Majobe moves in between these bodies, representing various working stations, trying to speak to each of them, but without getting a job. The workstations dissolve to a mine shaft, to a recruitment center, with Majobe, the mother, trying a luck on all these different spaces. A whole world is created through miming human bodies, ending in the ensemble, dissolving back to a train singing the same song as before, indicating a movement of from one space to another in Johannesburg. The train stops, but maintaining a single file. Performers remove their scarves from the waist and wind them over their heads with a line into a mine shaft. The scarves become the helmets with torches or lights in front of them. The single file becomes a network of tunnels through which the male performer moves through to reach the preferred working tunnel. The file dissolves and everybody becomes a mime. Everybody becomes a miner, miming, digging, drilling, and shoveling. The sound of these activities is produced by the performers. So they decide to increase the output of blowing by blowing one of the tunnels using a dynamite. They drop their scarves, helmets, and mime getting out of the tunnel into another. The dynamite countdown sound is produced by the performers. Performers become a dynamite and jump into the sky, producing an explosion sound. Boom! With their vocal articulations. The male performer is trapped in a part of the shaft and dies, and the story comes to an end. So this is a description of a laboratory project that my students did at the end of this semester. Now I would like to make sense of this description by way of introducing key terms that speak to Afrosonic Mine. Are we ready? Allow me to drink water. Now, providing descriptors for Afrosonic Mine. Now, one of the components or one of the ways of creating this mime is what I've called representational mime or mimetic realistic mime. This is the kind of movement or mime where a human body or human hands or whatever the actors, performers choose to use will produce a movement where the referent, which is that which is mimed, is made clear by a mime or movement that mimes that thing which is absent. The Zulu or Zulu language use the word ukudlala ngomoya, which is playing with air. In other words, you build castles in the air by making movements that respect the object that you have created. The Shona use the word kuyadzesera, which means trying to be something without being it or to imitate. Now, this creates a convention for overcoming the limitations of theater in terms of producing or bringing to bear the material world. Now, I want to move to the next aspect of Afrosonic mime, and I think I've used this term while I was making that description, the kinetic tableau. The kinetic tableau is made up of human bodies. Human bodies can create anything. It can be a machine, it can be a car, it can be a train. They join forces together by making movements. They don't try to be a train psychologically, neither do they try to be a bomb or a helicopter. They simply decide on a movement that kind of represents that which they are trying to mime. And then they produce the sound that accompanies that. For instance, in the case of a train, if I were to show you a video, they were producing movements like this. Uhambo and singing, uhambo yo sevenza, uhambo yo sevenza, uhambo yo sevenza, uhambo yo sevenza, uhambo yo sevenza. And while they were acting or miming as if they were trains, they were also being human. They were also human beings by having a verbal exchange amongst themselves. So everything is happening simultaneously without allowing one thing to override another. All things happen simultaneously. I shall come to character conceptualization in regards to that. In terms of the bomb, same thing. In the case of a dynamite, it is the bodies that are put together, and then they mime drilling a hole into a rock and put a dynamite, and they produce the explosion movement by the bodies moving together as a tableau and making the boom sound until the death of that other character. Let's go to the next term. The next term is something that I've called psychomages. Of course, these are all new terms. They are my own creation. Psychomages. It is a combination of psychology and images. Now, what are these? These are movements that are created to mime activities that happen in the interior microscopic spaces like intestines, urethra, in the mind, and so on and so on. Let me take the opportunity to recap one of the things that have happened there. Take, for instance, my description of the birth of a baby whilst the performers were creating a kinetic tableau of a vagina. So what was going inside the uterus was amplified by these bodies that were acting the vagina with cloth and labia and all those that was made by human bodies. In 2001, I did a production at the University of Cape Town called Trauma Center. It was a hospital. The characters were in a hospital and they were mentally deranged. So one of the characters was masturbating, male characters was masturbating. And then at the release, at the orgasmic level, when he was releasing the sperm, one of the characters became a sperm and started performing its movement outside the penis as he was releasing. So I call these psycho mages or things that happen inside the interior spaces that are given amplification by bodies that are moving in space outside on stage. So description, so the spaces are always interior, and if I had time, I would give you more examples of how these function. The next term would be metaphoric mime, which is use of one's body or an object in order to represent something which the body or object is not. Take, for instance, the example of the scarf that I mentioned when I was giving that description. The scarf is at once a scarf. It changes its meaning or its identity from a scarf to a baby inside the stomach, and then it changes to labia, to the vagina, to the creation of a vagina, and to the creation of pubic hair, and then it changes to the making of a gate, a gate through which the sangoma or shaman will enter, and then it changes to being used as a helmet and a light when they get into this mine shaft, and then it changes to a seat belt when they are traveling in a van, and so on and so on. And I think Elam Kerr calls that aspect the transformability of sign, which I call here metaphoric mime. It is a real object. It can be a sword or whatever one chooses, but it doesn't maintain its identity. Its identity is dependent on how it is used within the performance, such as the example of the scarf that I shared with you. Now, let me go to the last term. And of course, this is a developing paper. By the time I finish it, I will be having more terms to describe the activities that happen within the laboratory when I'm working with my students. So this term is not my term. It was, I think, coined by Lecoq when he was doing his own mime. And I find it very useful in terms of describing the things that I deal with when I'm working with my students. And I want to call it sprimages. Now, what are sprimages? These are performance of states of being, of feelings, of emotions, performance of spiritual visitations. It is performance of intangibilities. For example, lighting a candle, and then the performers perform the flame, or lighting a cigarette, and then the performers perform the smoke. They do not forget to add the sound of the flame of the smoke, or that, and that's the name Afrosonic Mine. Now, why have I called it sprimages? It is also the same concept that will describe what is happening in the spiritual realm. For instance, in the case of the shaman or the sangoma that I mentioned, when she is possessed by this spirit, the spirit is given amplification by performers who perform abstract images of this spirit that lives in the shaman, and thus my use of the word sprimages, which Lecoq gives as mimages. So at least there are some reference points in terms of citing examples which demonstrate how this one works. Now, do I have specific rules on how these have to be constructed? When my students ask me, how do we do it? My answer is, I don't know, but I want you to do it. So they experiment and produce. My job is to file that which works. So we're still developing a vocabulary of how this can be performed. But the fact of the matter is they end up with, with something that is abstract, which can be picked by the audience as something that represents a spirit or something that is happening, or something that represents a feeling or an emotion that is being played outside by the performers in that space. As I prepare to come to the end, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce the term vectorization. I think it's taken from mathematics. Now you can see that throughout the entire telling of the story, the performers keep shifting from one stage to the other. They keep shifting from one character to the other, or from one character to an object, or whatever the case may be. There is no consistency in terms of maintaining one thing. Therefore, in terms of legibility, or in terms of the ability to read this show, there are specific things that my performers use in order to move from one stage to the other. And I call these things shifters. They shift from one sequence to the other. It may be through use of song, or through use of dance, or through use of signs. For instance, when there is movement from the present to the past, which you may call a flashback, how do they suggest that there's movement of time from the present backwards into history? They may, for instance, use a clock sign such as this and go pa, 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 or they crouch down and turn on the same axis to suggest that there is change of time, and many other. Of course, these are just examples. There are many other ways of providing shifters. Now, in some particular cases, there is no clue as to the fact that a shift has taken place, and I call these cutters. In Shona, Jeko, to dismember, no clue will be given about the shift. The change is arbitrary. Once the sequence comes to an end, they pick up on another one and go to the next stage. Of course, these are called syntagmatic gaps. In postmodernism, they call them discontinuity, and it is to allow the mind to work hard or to bring in the process of ideation, which is allowing the mind to make sense of that which is happening in front of them. Now, there will be accumulators. Accumulators add information to the subject. The Zulu call it Butela or Koka. Shona call it Vunganidza. This is the process of adding material to what is already available. Now, there will be connectors. Connectors will be placards. Sometimes placards. Sometimes it is a statement getting into the mine shaft, or sometimes it may be any other thing that the performers may choose in order to offer these connections. Now, these various techniques of making shifts possible will allow the process of meaning making to take place, as there will be indicators or to assist the audience to follow the story as it transitions from one state of being to the other. Now, you can see that the performance does not happen in a single space, as probably would happen in a realist, naturalist environment, where a living room will be created and the story takes place there from the beginning to the end. Here, the spaces are limitless. Now, space is either an objective concrete space, symbolized by a real theater site, the stage space and its material components as designed by the visual artist, or it is a gestural one. Now, in this particular case, the space is a gestural one. Gestural one is an open space, which is the preferred one for African post-realist plays. It is invisible, it is unlimited, it is determined by its users as they move through it, creating its rules. Now, the description that I've just read to you will tell you how they shifted from the house setting to the car, to the train, to the workstations, to the tunnels, and so on and so on. And all they needed to do was to provide indicators with their bodies that the space has changed. So the space is like a palimpsest, one set of space melting into another and dissolving into something else. And the method of vectorization provides the shifts and the legibility that is required for the audience to follow the spaces that are forever changing. Now, I want to come to the conclusion. I've used the term post-psychophysical perspectives. Now, my understanding is that we all know what psychophysical perspectives are because we were all trained using Stanislavski or Western variations of Stanislavski, which is basically creating character by psychophysical means. We investigate the text, we look for objectives, we pursue them, and we pursue these objectives through cerebral means. Now, in what way is this technique, the Afro-technique, particularly as it relates to Afrosonic Mine, different, or is it challenging or problematizing psychophysical means? Now, psychophysical means are cerebral. Now, for my descriptions and all the examples that I've given you, you will see that there is no attempt at being something. You don't try to be a car cerebrally. You don't try to be a mine shaft or to be a bomb cerebrally. All things are attained by external means. You use the external in order to project any reality that you would like, including the things that are happening in the mind, the feelings, the emotions. They are all externalized through the body. Now, in psychophysical terms, you maintain character. You are one character from the beginning to the end. You invest in developing the journey of the character. Now, in this particular method, the Afro-technique, there is constant shift through the concept of assemblage theory that I talked about, that you are at one time human, in the next second you are inhuman, in the next second you play one character. There's always the term that I used, which is palimpsest, for forever changing from one state of being to the next, from one character to the next, until the play comes to an end. So, in other words, we can say there is maintenance or sustenance of character in one mode of performance, and bifurcation. Bifurcation means multiplicity of characters and objects or performance from the beginning to the end. You will have an actor and you will have a player or a performer. A performer normally dances, sings, is external, whereas an actor will try to pursue the psychophysical methods. Now, there will be linearity in the psychophysical realm, whereas there will be compressions and post-linear. The things are moving up and down until you come to the end of the show. Now, in terms of hierarchy of signs, the text will dominate the performance in a psychophysical realm, whereas to use a term that was coined by Hans Theis Lehmann, parataxis, which is non-hierarchy. There is Afrosonic Mime, there is song, there is dance, there is text, all of them happening with an equal share of measure in that particular production. And I think the rest of the things can be discussed further. When you ask me questions, I would like to end at this juncture. Claire, over to you. I hope what I said makes sense to you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Samuel, for that rich and often intriguing conversation. While you're all thinking about what you might like to ask Samuel in the next 20 or so minutes, I might just start. I think I found your thick descriptions of the work particularly interesting because I often find South African performance quite difficult to describe for those that haven't experienced it in any way. And I just found that you gave us such an opportunity to really see the imagination and the creation of culturally imbued signs and images, and there was so much that was offered through that. So thank you. I actually preferred it over you providing a video. You know, something to think about. So okay, I'm still wrapping my head around Afrosonic Mine, and my mind returns to this moment when you described this masturbation mime scene, right? And then the immediate embodiment of the sperm. Is this one example of what you say from, you know, this invisibility to visibility? And could you talk more about that if it's not?
Yes. Well, actually, everything that I've mentioned, all different categories of miming, are trying to turn what is invisible visible. If you look at what I termed representational mime, and I know that Lecoq calls it action mime, which is, you know, I decide that there's a chair here, and therefore I must behave as if this is a chair. So if I've got to navigate my movements around it, then I have to do that. And when I'm doing that, or when I'm moving it, if I move the chair, I will go, I'm producing the sound of the chair, so that my movements, aided by my voice or my vocal abilities, will make what is absent present, and therefore making what is invisible visible by the way in which I use my body and my sound. And that's the use of the term Afrosonic Mine. Remember, there's always the image and the sound brought together. Now, if I go to the next example, which is the example that you gave me, which is what I call psychomegens. Again, no, we can all see the sperm, which is the juicy-like substance, but we don't know how the little cells that science tells us do swim through the semen to go and conquer the ovals. We don't know how they look like unless we subject them to a microscope in order to investigate them. But theater, mime in this particular case, amplifies the sperm, and the sperm gets maybe a turtle image where it is swimming until it gets out of the urethra of the penis and falls on the ground. And in that case, we get a sense of the things that realism probably cannot give us, but mime can offer us that opportunity to enter into the interior spaces and make them visible to us. Yes, that's one of the dimensions. So thank you for asking that question and giving me the opportunity to explain what bringing the invisible to visibility means in that regard.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Thank you. Okay, so I've got a first question coming in from Nkululeko. Please jump on board and take yourself off mute if I just totally ruined the pronunciation of your name. And they say, thank you, Professor. My question invokes a politics of naming in this theory. Is there any particular reason why you name the tenets of the theory using English terms and provide Zulu Shona equivalents, descriptions, and not the other way around?
Well, in the context of decolonization, I think that's a big concern. I think because my audience is primarily Birmingham, I deliberately chose the English equivalents of African terms that I do have. Everything that I've said has got an African term. And when I finally write this chapter, by the way, I'm contributing to a Cambridge University Press book series called Elements. And this is one of the deliverables that I'll deliver in June. I will be having both English and African names for every concept that I'm having. For instance, mime would be ukudlala ngomoya, and I know that Nkululeko speaks Zulu. Ukudlala ngomoya simply means playing with air. In other words, you create things by using your body in the air and bring into existence that which is absent. So that would be the term for mime. And in Shona, I'm sure you remember, and I know that he speaks Shona. I know him. Kuyedzesera, trying to be but without being psychologically that person. So there are elements of trying to be, but without becoming that particular thing. So for everything that I've said, yes, there is an African indigenous term for that. And I'm happy to share that with anybody who needs it. Thank you.
Nkululeko has just written, thanks, Professor. Well understood. And I mean, that's, I think, certainly something that came up for me a lot is this process of renaming and new terminologies, because those that haven't been introduced to much African theatre and performance discourses, or many, they might not understand why this is important. Do you want to talk to that while we're waiting for the next question?
I'm not quite sure if you.
Sorry. So terminologies, so building new terminologies within theatre and performance, because yeah.
New terminologies, right? For something to come into existence, it must have a name, and it must have a language to describe it. And I know that the practice, as I said before, has been in existence for as long as plays like Rosa Albert were created, which is in the 80s. And of course, the practice predates the 80s. Most of the African dances are actually mime dances. So the fact of the matter is, if these were in existence, where is the theory and where is the language to describe them? So we have relied for a long time from the vocabulary created by Attand, Grotowski, and Lecoq. And I think what I'm trying to do is to say, hey, there's a practice here that is different from what you guys have known for a very long time. And here is the concept, and here are the conceptual terms and the vocabulary to use in order to talk about that practice. So I think when one is doing that, they are offering an alternative that speaks to a practice that wasn't known before. But I do understand the politics of language, which Nkululeko was trying to address. And I think by the time I finish this chapter and this deliverable, I would have solved that problem in almost in its entirety.
Yeah, I think you will have. So Paul commented on how there are lots of parallels with Rosa Albert. And yeah, I could certainly see that as well. I think I have it somewhere on my wall. That's what I was pointing to. Or maybe that was Borpa. Can't remember. I know it is Rosa Albert. So Adam has asked, would you be able to speak a little bit more about your students, what your students understand as acting, and how this challenges this, and how do they find it?
Okay. That's an interesting question, politically loaded as well. Initially, probably I need to contextualize that. Initially, Wits was a white liberal university located in apartheid South Africa. And everything that they were doing was a reflection of what a Western university would do. But with the coming of freedom in 1994, and of course the fees must fall, roads must fall movements that permeated the political landscape in South Africa from 2015, probably up to this moment, there was this huge structural feeling to decolonize the academy. And this is why precisely I'm doing what I'm doing. Now, what is the understanding of acting? Now, once one uses the term acting, it presupposes a way of conceptualizing the practice, which is basically, particularly if we were to rely on Kebb's paper, which talks about acting and not acting. I'm sure we are all familiar with it, acting and not acting. So there are levels of acting, and for a fully formed character, they must have all the elements of costume, of internalization of character based on the text, of having a voice and a body that represents the absent character or the character that is in the text and all those things. Now, when we do that, we eliminate all other kinds of performances where music, song, and dance are a major part of the performance. In other words, we jettison the African practice. Therefore, acting, as we know it today, privileges one mode of performance and excludes others. Now, in terms of, this is the reason, of course, why you guys have changed from drama departments, including the United States of America, to theater and theater arts, or theater and theater performance. And I think this is a worldwide movement to recognize the contribution of other cultures in the field of performance. Now, at first and second year level at WITS, we try to expose our students to other modes of acting / performance. First semester, as I mentioned in my abstract, they focus on a text that already exists, but which is post-realist / presentational, which is the thick description that I was talking about when I was delivering my paper. And then in the second semester, they shift to acting as we know it, which is basically Stanislavski and the 10 psychotechnique elements, imagination, magic if, you know, and so on and so on. And then they are allowed to make connections themselves without us making connections. No, this is one mode of performance you can do. This is another. Now, in most cases, particularly in South Africa, or let me just say Southern Africa, you will find that texts that are written, play texts that are written these days, will have all these elements together, where your skills as an actor, as a performer, as a dancer, as a mimer are required in the same performance. And therefore, we try to make our students broad in terms of their competencies of realizing how a performance can be performed. So they do this in their first and second years. Now, from there, we expose them to other modes of performance, which is acting for television or acting for camera, and creating their own work in those kind of contexts. So what will be my students' understanding of acting? Multicultural, in a word, multicultural, cross-cultural. Everything is important. Nothing is more important than the other. And they go through the entire 4 years of learning different ways of conceptualizing character, of performance, of dancing, of singing, and so on and so on, so that if they go anywhere in the world, they will be able to participate without any difficulty, except probably on accents, which the United States is quite much focused about. I understand if an African performer goes there, they will need to learn voice the American way, or else they will have to put titles when you are talking, and so on and so on. But in other areas, they will be able to be competent wherever they go, anywhere in the world. I don't know if that addresses your question.
Does it, Adam? Was that? He said excellent.
Excellent, okay.
Paul has asked, what is the process of preparing, oopsie, let me just come back, and entering into Afrosonic Mine? That preparation process.
What is the process of preparing? According to my students, the text is not a law that has to be obeyed. The text is a guide. So the magic word for Afrosonic Mime is improvisation. Once we pick a text and pick what it is that it suggests, we allow the students to improvise however they want. For instance, I'm going to give you an example from another thick description. In a play written by Andrew Whaley, it is called The Rise and Shine of Comrade Fiasco. The play begins with prisoners in a cell. And then my students decided to talk about, well, in the text, it said they fought in a bar. They fought in a bar before they could be brought into this prison. And then they were arrested by the police. And then they were put in this cell where their story is now unfolding. So here's what my students did. So we would like to show the moment of arrest. It's not in the text, it's mentioned as a line or two, And I said, well, go for it. So they did the whole sequence of constructing a bar scene where they were drinking. Of course, they were miming. Would you allow me to read this briefly? The characters are in a bar called Msongo Songo. At this stage, all of them are patrons. There is no built set to establish the location. The setting is established by bodies moving in space. The soundscape is produced by the performer to establish the music playing in the bar. So instead of playing real music, it is the bodies that are there in the bar that are going dun ding ding, dun ding dun ding ding, dun ding dun 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 ding dun 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 dun. Okay, so the setting is established by bodies moving in space. The soundscape is produced by the performers to establish the music playing in the bar. As they chant the song, they dance to it. The different spaces in a bar must be established. One of the performers mimes standing behind a counter, opening a bottle of liquor. Of course, this that is produced by the soundscape. Suddenly, the two patrons move towards the counter to order drinks for them. They do this while both are chanting and dancing to the music. So they knock on the imaginary counter, producing the noise by punching the air and producing the knocking of the sound. They respect the boundaries separating the bartender and the patrons. The bartender delivers the order by miming, handing over the imaginary glasses. He opens another bottle of beer, and then they start fighting. In the fight, everybody who was a patron dissolves into a police car. So each one of them is a part of the car. One of them is a siren. Wee, 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 wee. The other one is a light. The other ones are passengers in a police van, and they're talking to each other and blah, blah, blah. And then they arrive, they stop, and then they open the gate into the bar and they arrest them. And then they go into the prison singing a song. That's improvisation. And I give them the freedom to conceptualize and to think what it was before this thing began. And they do that in the form of improvisation. And that's how they work. That's my key word. We work and improvise. And according to them, quoting them verbatim, the text is a guide. It is not a law to be obeyed. And that's how they create. You are muted.
Sorry, there was a lot of noise next to me, so I muted myself temporarily. We've got a couple more questions. I'm going to go right up to 5:30 on our time of things here. So for 9 more minutes. If you can't stay for that time, thank you so much for coming. There's a lot of people that are thanking you here, Samuel, and I can pass you this chat once we're finished. And also someone has asked for you to send some work. So maybe that's something that you could do to send me, and then we can upload it with the video later if that's possible.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we're up to Richard. Can you identify for us some examples of African plays where Afrosonic Mine would be most appropriate? And could you explain a little bit about the audience experience of Afrosonic Mime in performance?
The African plays is what I've named the African great tradition or African canon. The first country to be independent in Africa was Ghana in 1957. So plays written from 1957, particularly from departments that were formed at the instruction of the new governments in order to decolonize the images. So the plays written by Wole Soyinka, Efua Sutherland, Hussein Abraham in Tanzania, all that new post-independent canon of plays will be plays that will have these kinds of performances. Take, for instance, Woza Albert by Arthur Fugard, Mongeni Ngema, and Pesimtwa, The Island by the same author. Talk of The Rise and Shine of Comrade Fiasco by Andrew Whaley. Talk of Workshop Negative by Konti Mhlanga. Well, basically, plays that were produced by African intellectuals after the fact of independence from 1957, and plays that were produced by artists working in workshop theatre in South Africa, in Southern Africa, to advance the same agenda. All those plays would be plays that reflect, or that will have music, song, dance, mime, and text. Ngugi wa Thiong, almost all his plays, like Ngaika Ndayenda, I'll Marry When I Want, and so many of them will have this. In fact, if you read his philosophical work, Decolonizing the Mind, there's a chapter dedicated to what he calls the language of African theatre, where he's analyzing his plays. That's where you find most of that stuff written down by him.
Great. And could you explain a bit more about the audience of Afrosonic Mine?
This thing, like I said, this is not my invention. My job is to make sense of what has been happening and giving it a language. Just like Aristotle did not invent dramatic theory, he was simply looking at the work of his contemporaries, Aristophanes, Sophocles, and so on and so on. And by looking at the work, he came up with the common features that came from that, and he called that dramatic theory, which is the Freytag pyramid structure. So I would like to say that my theorization and my making sense of the work is not a new thing. The practice has been there. So the audience do know how to read the work because they've been watching it since 1957 up to the present moment. So it has become, so it has become part of their baggage, which they bring to the theater before the theater begins, which they use in order to receive and to analyze and to make sense of it. And I would understand the difficulties that somebody from a different culture would experience if they were watching that show for the first time. But as I said, we try as much as possible through the concept of vectorization to provide clues as to where the action is happening, the cutters, the accumulators, the shifters, and so on, so that you don't get lost.
Yeah, great. And I mean, there is quite a different relationship between the audience and performers as well, which might be something.
Well, the most interesting ones, will be, some of them will join in the singing if there's a song. So so there will be no demarcation of the performer and audience. They will join and love it, or even whistle and cheer you up if you are dancing and singing. Oza, come on, yeah, yeah. and Kululeko will agree with me. And I see Silvanos Jola is there as well. They will agree with me that that's the nature of African audiences. And Ushilon there, I see him.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people are nodding behind their screens. So I'm going to see what I can do here in terms of combining a few questions. Paul has suggested or asked, does impro and ritual differ in terms of access and outcome?
Say that again.
Does ritual and impro differ in terms of access and outcome?
I'm not quite sure if I do understand the question, but let me answer from what I think I've understood. Normally, the matrix of performance is something that already exists. For most of Soyinka's plays, they are based on a Nigerian ritual. But it is not the performance of a ritual itself, but it's something from the ritual that he uses, and he injects or infuses other texts into the framework in order to create a play. So in a manner of speaking, every Soyinkan play is a performance of ritual of sorts. Songs that are normally included in these plays come from ritual spaces. So as you sing and dance, they are elements of the ritual. So I wouldn't, well, I hope I'm answering the question. I wouldn't think that ritual is anything that is outside an African kind of performance. It is a part and parcel of it.
Yeah, great. And can Sylvanus has asked, can a director prepare, map, block Afrosonic Mine before getting into the rehearsal room?
I think there are different kinds of working, smart directors, very gifted directors would do that. But the fact of the matter is they then lose on the creativity of the performers. In my several years of working with performers, I've discovered that they are the most resourceful persons, much as the director is. And me personally, I enter the space as an unknowing director, and I work by instinct or by inspiration. The things that we discover in the moment of doing are the things that we file into something that the audience will eventually see. And I don't know what kind of performance I would produce if I were to think on my own and cause everybody else to be uncreative and obey what I want. I've always benefited personally as an unknowing director who enters the space knowing nothing, and we participate in co-creation of the work. That's my working ethos. I'm not dismissing any other method where a very smart director can bring all the knowledge to the actors and they do it.
Great. So we have to wrap up, but I will finally read these two questions. And if you like, you can always send an email to them at a later stage. So Alam has asked, can mime theatre discuss social or political issues related to race or gender, or is it just for entertaining? And finally, Butchilo has asked, sorry, there's a few questions here. Could you speak to pre-colonial performative practices where Afrosonic mime is a key element, where plays were not written using colonial languages? There's a thesis for you there.
Okay, let me answer the first question.
Oh, I do want to wrap up for everyone else that's given us our time. And Butchilo and Alam, could you send me an email? I'm putting it in here, and we'll try and get some type of answer to you at some point. But I want to respect everyone else's time that you've given us today. I just want to put our hands together or a clap on your on your emoticon for Samuel Ravengai today. It's been such a pleasure to have you here, Samuel, and I'm really excited about future conversations across continents.
Thank you, Claire, and thanks to colleagues and members of the audience, some of them that I do know. Thanks, I appreciate your receptive and insightful comments and questions. Thank you so much, I do appreciate it.